Friends, a couple years ago, I told you about visiting Dominica, the tiny Caribbean island where my great-grandfather came from, and about the Kalinago, the indigenous people there. When Columbus's ship reached the island in 1493, they did not stop. The island itself is rugged and mountainous, and European conquerors at first deemed it not fit for settlement, i.e., not likely to turn a profit. So the Spanish did little with the small island, but the French took it in 1632, and in 1660, the French and English agreed that Dominica and St. Vincent, a neighboring island, should not be settled, but instead left to the Kalinago people as a neutral territory. But I bet you know how that went. Dominica's natural resources attracted expeditions of English and French foresters who began harvesting timber. And in 1690, the French established their first permanent settlements. French woodcutters from Martinique and Guadeloupe, neighboring islands, began to set up timber camps to supply the French islands with wood, and they gradually became permanent settlers. They also brought the first enslaved Africans from West Africa to Dominique, as they called it in French. And to this day, Dominican Creole culture and language is French-based, even though the British took it over in 1763 when they took the island in the 7 Years' War. The British system of slavery was more brutal than the French. In fact, the British were so hated that when the French attempted to retake the island in the late 18th century, the local population aided and abetted them in every way they could. But this attempt was unsuccessful. During all this time, the Kalinago continued to live in the densely wooded, mountainous interior of the country, having been gradually pushed out of the coastal regions. They lived in the part of the island that literally remained unmapped until aerial photos were taken in 1950. An area marked by maze-like ridges of rock, little flat land for farming. And so they would conduct raids on French and then British plantations. And since almost the beginning of colonization, the Kalinago were joined in their settlements by shipwrecked or deserting Europeans and escaped African slaves. First from the more commercially viable neighboring islands, and then from British chattel slavery when it was established on Dominica. Over the course of 44 years, it is estimated that 100,000 enslaved Africans were transported to Dominica either to work there or to be moved on, as it was a center of the Caribbean slave trade. But the mountainous island of Dominica was soon recognized as the place to be for escapees. It was more easily defensible than the flatter coastal land in the interior, unusable for commercial purposes, and so soon maroon communities, that is, communities of escaped African slaves, sprung up all along the interior of Dominica. At the height of slavery on the island, at least 13 separate communities are known to have existed. And only the angriest, most motivated slaveholders would attempt to recapture their slaves from this terrain. But the British military often tried, and punishment was swift and brutal. 50 lashes for women and 100 for men who were recaptured was not uncommon. And worse, for community leaders, one named Bala was taken to the marketplace to be displayed in a narrow iron cage called a gibbet, and he took a week to die. The people sang and still sing a refrain in Creole, Bala mort, boagateo, means Bala is dead, the woods are spoiled. But the communities themselves flourished. Free societies, often joined by the Kalinago, these maroon communities became arguably the center of East Caribbean resistance to slavery. Often run by elders who had been born in Africa, they also became centers of African language and preserved many indigenous African practices, such as divination. From these communities, they conducted raids on plantations. They also created strategies to pit British and French colonial powers against one another. And they sang, and they danced. They composed music in Dominican Creole that survives to this day. So it was not an accident that 2 years after slavery was abolished, in 1835, the first 3 men of African descent were elected to the Legislative Assembly of Dominica. 1835. Many slaves from the neighboring French colonial islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique fled to Dominica at this time as well. And in 1838, it became the first colony of the British West Indies to have an elected legislature controlled by an ethnic African majority. Though that legislature was abolished a couple of decades later by the British, who still held control, as it did not align with their financial interests. Now, of course, slavery would still be alive and kicking in the US decades after it was abolished in Dominica. While enslaved people in the US were introduced to Christianity through white missionaries and plantation churches, they made the religion their own. Enslaved Africans in America took the master's religion, meant to subjugate and devalue them, and made it into an empowering, liberating force in their communities. While masters formed slave missions to encourage obedience, Africans formed their own worship meetings, which came to be known as Hush Harbor meetings, where participants could reinterpret Christian teachings in a way that emphasized liberation, dignity, and communal strength. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? Thank you for joining me. This spiritual was one about waiting on God for the right time, for the Spirit to come, for the right time for liberation. But it was also often a code, sung when it was time to meet in secret. Hush Harbors served as the location where the enslaved could combine their African religious traditions with Christianity. It was safe to freely blend those components in these spaces, and they could also let go of their hardships, express their emotions, and this is, in fact, where most of the Negro spirituals originated. The creation of these songs contained a double meaning revealing the ideas of religious salvation and freedom from slavery. And of course, again, they would dance, African shouts and rhythms. And we're told by Tricia Hersey, historian and founder of the Nat Ministry, that enslaved people often only slept 4 hours a night. But here they were together, singing and dancing. They kept their traditions and their hope alive. And so beyond serving as spaces for secret worship, Hush Harbors also became the foundation for the rise of independent Black churches after emancipation. Historians note that leadership, music, and communal traditions formed in these gatherings directly influenced later Black congregations, shaping African American religious identity and providing organizational models for freedom and activism. So friends, why do I tell you these things? These people are my own physical ancestors, but they are all of our spiritual ancestors. They are people who found themselves in the most horrific systems of oppression, systems that literally wanted them dead, circumstances even harsher than what we currently face. And they not only survived, they thrived. They determined their own future. They preserved and built their culture, their music, their hope outside of, but right under the nose of their oppressors. When the dominant culture said they were at best irrelevant as human beings, they built culture that said otherwise, that provided physical and spiritual care for their communities. And I think sometimes in our justice work, we focus so hard on resisting that we forget about the world we dream of living in. Yes, the Kalinago and the Maroons and the enslaved people in the U.S., they all resisted, as we all have to continue resisting. There are too many members of our human family whose lives and livelihoods are on the line. But friends, they also built. They built lives of music and community and mutual care, of connection and of love, in the face of disconnection and extreme hatred. Diverse people from disparate African tribes, different languages, different cultures, different religions, and in Dominica also the Kalinago. They all built communities of strength and sharing that became the basis for their community structures and religious faith well after the hateful institution of slavery ended. In Dominica, the basis for self-rule and eventual independence from Britain sprang out of these communities, and in the U.S., emancipation and the later and still ongoing fights for civil rights. Without the Maroons, there would be no modern Dominican state. Without hush harbors, there would be no African American church, and arguably no civil rights movement. Friends, our spiritual ancestors have provided us with a blueprint for these times. We also need to be building lives that aren't based on the dominant culture. We need to be building structures and communities that, in addition to the hard work of keeping us safe and alive, keep us hopeful, keep us joyful and connected. Remind us in an inhuman system of what it means to be human. Structures and communities that will endure when this system of horror passes away under the weight of its own ignorance and hatred, as they all eventually do. Friends, now is the time to start building new ways of being. In a time and place where the forces in power are doing everything to sow division, to make us disappear, we need to build our own structures that contain joy and creativity and life. This is one of the most subversive things that we can do. And the blueprint is surprisingly simple. Sing together. Move your bodies together. Feed one another. House one another, physically and spiritually. Celebrate who we are, a people who value the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. A people with love at the center of who we are and what we do. A people who are still alive, still able to share love despite the powers arrayed against us. We heard earlier from Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. It's pretty worth celebrating, don't you think? Every Sunday, all the times in between, and in celebration, there is hope. In creating new ways of being with one another, in showing and affirming for each other a new way of being together, we begin to create that better, more just, more equitable world that we dream of. When we come together in sheer joy of the fact that we can hold ourselves and each other up where mainstream culture has failed. When we feed one another and clothe one another, watch each other's kids, when we harmonize together, dance and sway together, embodying our one spirit, our one unified and loving purpose of justice for all. We're not just resisting systems that would dominate our bodies. We're reaffirming for one another again and again that joy exists among us and will continue to exist among us. That the new world we dream about really is possible because we have communities that will make it so. And that we, along with so many others, are working and celebrating, working to build a world that is more than just the one we find ourselves in. Celebrating because as long as we are together doing it, there is hope. May it be so.